Okay, welcome back, Psych 250 students. We're going to continue with Chapter 8, the case study of Papa in the garage. So knowing how Mom filled out the forms, I made a decision, which is typical when you're doing family therapy, is to meet with Mom, or meet collectively first, kind of outline what I was going to do for that day, then meet with Mom separately, and meet with Son separately, and then kind of regroup with everybody at the end of the session. Now, I knew the subject was going to be pretty sensitive, but the overwhelming theme that I found, first I started with the facts, but then you examine the emotions, right? The facts of the case, as presented by both of them, were Mom and Son were in the house, in the kitchen. Mom's cooking up a storm for dinner. She tells Son, go to the garage and get your dad and tell him that dinner's ready. Dad was typically in the garage working on projects, tinkering around or something of that nature. So Son goes to the garage and goes through the side door and sees, initially cannot find his father, but then eventually sees that his father's hanging from the rafters of the garage. Dad had hung himself and killed himself. Son starts screaming and crying. Mother hears Son, isn't sure what's going on, runs to the garage, and then she's overwhelmed by what she sees. The ambulance is called, the police are called. We're sorry, there's nothing we can do. Tragedy. When I spoke to Mom, one of the themes I heard over and over was what I mentioned in the first video, the confusion, right? The incredible sadness, being overwhelmed from going from a two-parent household to one parent, and also the confusion of as to why. How could she possibly have missed this? Also the anger, the resentment. How could you leave and abandon us? Lots of guilt, lots of if onlys in her script. If only I'd been a better wife. If only I'd cleaned up the house better. If only I had encouraged him more. Lots of self-blame. And that's very normal. And we talked about the process of grief, how it's going to take some time, and not to apologize for her emotions. It is possible to love and be angry at the same person at the same time. With the child, very similar patterns. Lots of mixed emotions, very difficult to talk about, but this notion of if only I'd picked up my toys, if only I'd done better in my math class, all this feeling that as a child that they could have made a difference, that somehow they were directly or indirectly responsible for, in this case, the father's suicide. So cases like this are a long-term process, and the mother even asked, how long would this grief last? And there's no easy answer to that. It's how much time do you have? You can get past certain feelings of being overwhelmed, but at some point, a birthday is going to come up, an anniversary is going to come up, a holiday is going to come up, a certain song will play, a clip from a movie. Somebody in the news will talk about suicide, and the stuff all comes back. So thankfully, Mom was smart enough to get help and help her son with the process as she was getting help herself. Yeah, tough cases for sure. We talked about methods. Some of these methods are extremely effective, certainly firearms, drug overdoses. Some people who survived these attempts sometimes are very grateful. When you have individuals, for example, who jump off a building and you have somebody trying to talk them down, one of the things they've noticed again and again is the person's leaping off a building. Sometimes they'll reach back. Now, they're not necessarily reaching back to say, you know what, I'm going to take you with me. I'm not going by myself. they're reaching back because they don't want to die. Very tragic. They want a second chance. Certain professions can produce all kinds of potential pressures to contemplate suicide. You're dealing day in and day out with sadness or illness. That's why even in psychological professions, if you go on to be a practitioner and do therapy with people, excuse me, self-care is so crucially important. You have to have, I mentioned in the first video, you have to have something to look forward to every day. You have to have those short-term goals, those long-term goals. I'm always working on projects besides grading all my students' papers, and I just calculated that if I have on average, let's say, starting off the semester in excess of 240 students, I'm going to be grading approximately 4,200 papers, projects, right? That's a lot of grading. But I also have my own things. I've got my scrapbooks, I've got my collections, I've got my things to do. We all should have those things that bring us pleasure, right? So the constant themes of guilt and resentment and feeling overwhelmed and sad and very, very normal when it comes to suicide cases. It wouldn't surprise me that mom and son, once they thought that they were done with psychotherapy, that at some point they might want to revisit a therapist because some lingering issues might come along. For example, can I even at some point get involved in another kind of relationship, especially with this idea that will this person abandon me too in some form or fashion? So those things need to be worked on, right? We like to think that kids are resilient and they can take anything and they'll bounce back and they'll just be fine. But we see evidence that sometimes there are some long-term consequences. Sigmund Freud said that we're a product of our upbringing, in essence. And you think about your characteristics, your sense of humor, your preference for music or food, and you think, well, a lot of that was influenced early in my life. Well, the same thing goes with negative experiences too. Those affect us. They challenge us. They change us. It's not a guarantee that we're going to suffer the rest of our life, but we have to be cognizant that that might happen. As I mentioned before, young people are susceptible. I think things are so much drastically different today. In my day, as I went to school in Detroit, I had to be wary of violent individuals in my community or bullies at school. But today, you have to not only navigate that, but you have to navigate what happens in social media. We're bombarded with all kinds of messages, and not all of them are very pleasant. So it's not like we can escape. Okay, I made it home safely, so I don't have to worry about the bully for the rest of the day until tomorrow at school. No, they have access through our social media feeds. And a lot of times these bullies are not even people we know. Getting away from the pain is the main factor. And these are the folks I talk with in therapy who had attempted suicide, and they were quite open and honest. And sometimes there were multiple attempts. And that was the recurring thing. I just want the pain to stop. Don't necessarily want to die. I want the pain to stop. I want my circumstances change. Now, I used to keep a little magic wand in my office, my therapeutic office. And I said, you know what? I wish, and I take the wand. I says, if you want to take this and wave it over yourself, you're welcome to it. I wish I could have the power to do that. It's going to take some time to change the circumstances. It's going to take some time to change your feelings, but things will change. If you make some changes in your life, things will change, but maybe not as fast as you'd like them to be, but they will change, and there is hope. Here's some information about increasing the likelihood when folks are bullied. And you know what's sad to me is the number of people after someone who's a victim of bullying hurts themselves, maybe even kills themselves. And the number of people have said, you know what? Yeah, that kid was bullied. I should have said something. It's amazing when people do stand up to bullies or intervene, how empowering that is, right? Not allowing people to be victimized, to me, is the definition of a real superhero, right? Now, the questions. I'm so glad you watched these videos and studied and read your work, your textbook, because taking good notes, because I have 4 questions from this chapter. Last chapter, we talked a little bit about Martin Seligman, and this chapter covers Mr. Seligman too, who I had the pleasure of meeting. Very nice individual, gave me 2 free hand-signed books, so he's definitely on my favorite list. And of course, we think of Martin Seligman as one of the proponents of positive psychology, but his early research looked at learned helplessness. This notion that sometimes we honestly believe there's nothing we can do in our circumstances to change the bad things that are happening to us, so we give up. We're the dog that just lies there receiving the electrical shock when we can clearly escape, but we do not. Of course, with people, it's very complicated. Of course, there's a question on the case study of Papa in the garage. Tell me everything you remember about this case study, very tragic case study. The relationship between suicide and gender. There clearly are gender differences. We talked about some of the pressures, how society is slow to change. As much as we've evolved, we are similar in some ways throughout the generations. And the last question deals with a suicide contract. Therapists are obligated to use a suicide contract when they suspect that one of their clients is in fact suicidal. So what's a contract? Contract is a document that says that you as a client who has expressed some ideation of suicide will not commit suicide. Well, what good is a contract? People can just sign all kinds of things and still kill themselves. Absolutely. But if you signed a document, that means your therapist has acknowledged what your current circumstances are. And you've made a commitment to come back and not harm them yourself. And if you have those feelings of harming yourself, and the best thing you can do is call somebody, call the police, go to the nearest hospital emergency room. Yeah, but the person still killed themselves and they signed the contract. The contract means nothing. It's a form of protection. It's a form of obligation. So as a client, you're thinking, I signed that thing. I don't want to disappoint my therapist. Or as a therapist, if somebody does die, you said, you know what? I addressed this issue. It's a protection. Absolutely crucial. Some people say, well, don't talk about it because the person might kill themselves. If you don't talk about it, they might. So you got to process things. That's it for Chapter 8. Can't wait to talk about Chapter 9. Take care.